The War Within expansion is just around the corner, and it's not getting easier to pick a main with all of the changes that we've had with the hero talents and the class reworks. And that's the topic of today's video, because sometimes we just want an easy spec to do. Maybe it is for our main, maybe it is for our all, but we don't want to spend our entire lives reading guides and doing training dummy sessions to figure out exactly where our rotation sucks. We just want to play an easy spec, and we're going to be looking at that today. From my perspective, of course, what is the easiest range DPS to play to the hardest in the War Within? So we're going to be starting off with Affliction, which is still undergoing changes. It's kind of unclear where it would be in the end in the easy, hard difficulty scale, but since it's been through 4 rework-ish patch builds where they keep moving talents around, redesigning talents, rewording talents, rebuffing, re-nerfing things, it still kind of feels the same, more or less. You might have 1 or 2 different intricate things to think about and actually engage with, which is fine because, you know, everybody should go through that. But overall, I think it's a middle of the pack. It's not a particularly difficult spec, it's not a particularly easy spec, and you still have to spin a few plates. It feels like they're just making it so that the plates are easier and easier to spin as time goes on, or it could just be that I'm playing enough Warlock where it becomes easier, but overall, I think it's fine. I think it's around B tier-ish. And we still have to keep going in our ranks to better tiers like S tier, which is where our second channel belongs to. Haha, segue, yes. We do have a second channel, youtube.com/@Marcelian&Flame, where we actually put videos with Marcelian there as well, because people have been wondering where he is, and I haven't kept him in the basement, no, but we are recording a show every Thursday talking about all sorts of topic in the World of Warcraft community, everything that's been announced, changes to the game and things like that, and we make videos and clips and take segments and topics of discussion and put them there on the other channel. It's uncensored, unfiltered-ish, and very little editing. It's more raw, more real Marcelian Online experience. So check it out after this video. Leave a like and subscribe if you like the content. It helps us out because it's a new channel and it needs to grow. Probably not as much as Augmentation, because Augmentation is still a fairly easy spec, and I have played a little bit. I know people think it's super easy, maybe the easiest and brain dead. Probably. I don't know if I would think about it that way. It's easier than Affliction. I wouldn't call it the easiest, so it doesn't reach the S tier, the tier of the grandma specs, because you kind of still have to have a little bit of game knowledge to know exactly when, how, and who to buff in your party, although it has been made more streamlined and straightforward in the War Within, where there is a buff. I need to log in because I keep forgetting the name of this buff, but there is a new buff that you have an augmentation that you put on yourself where when somebody uses a DPS cooldown, a major one, they get lit up. They have like a little beam of spotlight so you know where that person is, and you can just breath of eons towards their general direction and just hit them with all of your buffs. Of course, when it comes to prescience, I'm never going to be able to say this right. You probably will need a little bit more of a know-how on who to do and who to put things on. And that's probably what's keeping it from being S tier level easy, but it's still, rotation is fairly straightforward. Sure, Scale Commander and Chrono Warden adds some slight level of depth, but I wouldn't go out of my way to think that that would actually make Augmentation any more complex than it already is. Balanced Druid is in a similar situation, although it is on the precipice of some changes. Not changes that people like. So let's talk a little bit about it, because I haven't decided where I want to put it. I kind of want to put it next to Augmentation, but it is slightly harder, and it's not harder in a fun, engaging way. It's kind of harder in an annoying way. So first of all, why would I consider it a fairly easy spec? The rotation is fairly straightforward. Eclipse is fairly straightforward. You have close to no RNG. It's very predictable. You can probably call out your next 20 globals that you press and be like 98% accurate about what you're going to be pressing, and you're going to be playing Balanced Druid that way. And the talents have been made slightly even less complex with the removal of Arcanic Pulsar, which some people like, some people don't. I find it boring that we lost it and we don't have anything else in return. Playing with Orbital Strike might be a little bit more interesting, but still doesn't add a lot of depth, considering that even Stellar Flare has a relative spot in your playstyle, because you can just play Waning Twilight with, I forgot the name, whatever makes your Starfire and Wrath crit, put a dot in, and you can just activate Waning Twilight that way. It can get particularly difficult on fights like, let's say, Amidrisil's Council style fights, where you have to maintain Moonfire, Sunfire, and Stellar Flare on more than 2 targets. That can be quite plate spinny, and I would probably put it around C tier level easy, because it's not that easy. And there is another part of its difficulty when it comes to, for instance, Mythic Plus, because even with the changes in the rework, and although none of these have addressed this issue whatsoever, you still have to kind of ramp. You still have to multi-dot, and even though Shadow Priest, Affliction Warlock have received, even Destro Warlock have received some way of applying dots in an AoE fashion with one spell, Balanced Druid still has to tap, target, tap, target, tap, target, tap, target, tap, target, tap, target, and whoever says that you only need one Sunfire to put on your entire group, you clearly haven't played Mythic Plus with a puck tank that just decides to pull mobs every 3 or 5 seconds, and you're never done dotting your targets, and it's not a fun playstyle, it's not an intricate playstyle, you don't get any upsides from it, you even risk capping astral power, and juggling all of that can get a little bit cumbersome, and like I said, not in a fun way. So maybe I will put it into B tier, maybe because I'm also hoping that some of the issues with Balanced Druids will be addressed to kind of get people onto it. I think a lot of Balanced Druid mains are looking to swap from it, and that's not a good look, honestly. Arcane Mage. Ooh, now, listen, Arcane Mage, I think the last time we did one of these tier lists where we looked at the difficulty and ease of play for these specs, Arcane Mage took the cake at the hardest. So that would probably put it into F tier now, because it's the least easy out of all of them. But it has received some very, very good changes in the War Within, making it a little bit more streamlined. It's not as difficult, but it's not as difficult in a bad way, kind of like polar opposites of Balanced Druid. It's easier in a more fun and engaging way. You still have a level of depth to it. There still are a bunch of mechanics that work behind the scenes to kind of give you a little bit more skill expression in your overall damage rotation and how you actually perform. And I think that's great. Maybe it's one of the best examples of how a difficult spec should be approached. I wouldn't call it super difficult. I would probably put it into C tier. It's not the least easy spec in the game. I think that goes to something else, and we'll get to it eventually. But it's not as hard as it is right now currently in Dragonflight. The rotation doesn't feel as specific, although things might change once people start to, you know, come up with the proper builds and get everything out on the open and figure out that the rotation has 50 lines of text that you need to follow. That might change, but as it stands right now, even as a newbie, if you look at Arcane and you look at your talents, you can kind of tell, okay, this is kind of what I want and this is how I kind of have to play. So it's a little bit more intuitive than, let's say, the live version is, but still don't underestimate it too much. You can, of course, underestimate BM Hunter as much as you like, and as much as I don't like to put it there, that is kind of where it is, and it's kind of like a meme. I do also have to say that it's not as easy as it used to be, and I think we say this in every such tier list because BM still slightly gets a little bit of a death, a little bit of an extra little platey things to spin depending on your build, depending on your rotation. Talents are kind of being moved around for BM right now, and it's still in the fresh Hunter rework zone where it might still get new stuff, although I would be very surprised if it becomes more complex for any reason because it's a very popular spec. People know what to expect from it. The devs don't really want to put off the main BM Hunters, not to throw any shade or anything at them. It's perfectly fine. We don't need to have every spec being complex. We don't need every spec to be easy. But if you're a main BM Hunter and it's one of the most played specs in the game, you probably are expecting the spec to more or less behave in the same manner. And it kind of does, even with the hero talents and everything that's been added to it. Maybe it has one extra thing you might have to do or be aware of, but it's not particularly difficult. And the playstyle is very, very consistent across the board. Demonology is a Warlock spec that is very accurate and insightful because I can look at it and see that it is a Warlock indeed. I am trying to think of how to put this spec right now because it's just a week ago it has its Doom playstyle completely changed to back where it is right now in the tier set, which I think it might be slightly harder to execute properly as opposed to sniping low HP targets with your actual Doom, which was more global heavy and rotation cumbersome, let's say. than the current version, but there's still some complexity level left that we could probably have or see in the future for Demonology. It's looking like the rework for it at the very least is more or less done. I'm not sure if they're going to be adding anything more, probably just tuning the numbers right now to make all the talents and all the builds more or less competitive. A lot of the complexity for Demonology has been last with the removal of Nether Portal, which at the beginning of the rework, they mentioned that they want to keep just, you know, in the chamber to see if they need to fire it back up in the talent tree. It's not looking like it's going to be coming back, and that added a level of complexity that wasn't fun for a lot of people. I enjoyed it, but I'm a masochist. So with that being said, I would probably still put it kind of middle of the package, maybe a little bit easier than Affliction. I don't know. We might see it go up or down a tier depending on how we end up with the final builds of Demonology when people figure out exactly what to do. The hero talents add maybe a little bit more depth to Demonology than they do for other specs in this tier list. So I think it's a fair place to put it, like middle of the tier. This is not that easy, not that hard. It's B tier. That's what B tier is. Destruction similarly is, I would probably make it a little bit easier than the other ones. It doesn't have that many things you need to do. I'm not sure how Dimensional Portal will play out in the end in the rotation. It has never been a particularly difficult playstyle to incorporate in your game. You usually just fire your Dimensional Portals. But we have seen that they want to dive deeper into this style of gameplay for Destruction. It's not obvious right now that we're in its final stage, although similar to Demonology, the final version of the rework might just be what it is right now. Maybe we'll have more depth added into the future. But overall, I think Destruction is just easier than the other Warlock specs. So I'm going to rank it a little bit higher. It still has its little things that you need to do and little platy spins to do. And it's single target. If you do end up playing something like Soulfire, and I don't even know if you're going to be playing Shadowburn or anything like that, might be slightly more complex. But still, I believe it's generally easier than most of the other specs. Fire Mage. Ooh, something that I have been personally enjoying a lot of in the beta and alpha for the War Within and the rework, and even on the live servers. Fire Mage is one of the... Still, we're simping for it, one of the best specs designed in terms of how the talents work and how it actually plays. This is not necessarily new. You've probably heard this by now a million times. And Fire Mage is not a particularly easy spec to play. I don't know where it stands with the difficulty. Some specs are harder to understand and easier to play once you understand them. Some specs like Fire are easy to understand what you need to do, but being able to play them mechanically might be a little bit harder. So I'm going to be putting this into C tier. I don't think it's the hardest spec to play. I don't know if it's harder than Arcane. Maybe put it slightly in front of Arcane in terms of the easiness of the spec. You still have to do quite a bit of things, and to be fair, I think the Mage hero talents might have the most going on in the background. However, I'm not sure exactly how much you will care, because they kind of just work on their own. The spec drives itself in terms of the hero talents. For Fire, there might be, maybe for Sunfury, one or two things that you want to be aware of when you play with your spell spheres. I'm not sure if we're gonna micromanage them in any way once we get to like end game, or if we just, you know, just keep them there and they just buff you passively and you don't really care too much about it. That's where Fire Mage is. Frost Mage is slightly easier than the other two Mage specs, maybe a lot easier than the other two Mage specs, and I kind of was hoping that we would see some rework, some things being addressed to Frost Mage, because it's still very consistent. Maybe that's good for a lot of people that don't particularly engage with new stuff, and you probably will play similar builds in the War Within that you are playing right now, or that you have been playing throughout the Dragonflight, depending on what tier set bonuses we get. Glacial Spike is still a fun spell to play. Freezing Rain and Freezing Orbs and all of that will be pretty cool. We still don't know where Frozen Orb will end up in our rotation, with the tier set actually impacting it a little bit more. Looking out for that. I don't think it's a particularly hard spec. I kind of want to put it next to this Destruction Warlock, but I think by sheer fact of being a mage, you are playing a more difficult class to perform with, since mage has a little bit more skill expression in terms of its utility, defensives, and how you engage with content, stuff like Alter Time and Greater Invisibility, and cycling your barriers on people and, you know, blinking all over the place, or maybe playing Ice Flows, like those kind of things add a little bit more complexity to it. So I don't know if I'm going to put it next to Distro, but it's definitely not Fire Mage or Arcane level. Maybe I'll put it behind Balanced Druid, and Balanced Druid might be a little bit easier than Frost Mage to play properly, but that's probably just very subjective. Moving into marksmanship, I think this is a fairly standard spec in terms of its difficulty as well. It can have some moments in its rotation where actually playing properly might matter a lot more. So messing up one of your cooldowns or the order that you're doing things might actually impact your performance a little bit more than normal. Keeping trick shots up is very important in AoE, but not very hard to do also. And certain cooldowns, the way you use them, the way you do your rotation changes in like true shot windows and things like that, kind of alter how you normally play marksmanship. So being aware of that matters, which is why, let's say, it's not that easy, even though mechanically it's not a particularly difficult spec to play. There is also an inherent, maybe subjective difficulty in terms of the amount of hard cast that you have to do that you might not expect. And even at the beginning of the season, while you have less haste than normal, your aim shots take quite a little bit of time to fire off, and that might take getting used to, because, you know, we're learning the new mechanics of the content of the dungeons and the raids, and timing everything up might be a little bit more difficult, but it's not usually a generally difficult spec to play. I don't know exactly where I'm gonna put this around B tier-ish, maybe kind of in the middle. Let's put it in the middle there. Devastation has been, ever since its inception, a fairly easy and straightforward spec to play. Probably slightly harder than Augmentation, however, it's still a fairly easy spec to play. It doesn't have a lot of plates to spin, and some of its skill expression has been removed from the game, with Dragon Rage having a different way to increase its duration as opposed to just clipping your disintegrates, which wasn't necessarily difficult, but it was something that was not intuitive for a lot of people, and being able to do it properly took a little bit of a practice. And if you probably play Flame Shaper, maybe you'll have a more engaging rotation with adding Firestorm to it, if you do end up adding Firestorm to your kit, which is an extra button that you have to press, and you do have to press it, and managing the dots and engulf can be very, very, very fun, but also a little bit harder to do than just playing a naked Devastation, let's say, that we have right now in Dragonfly. So I'm not sure. I don't want to put it at the same level of Augmentation, but I don't think it's as hard as maybe, let's say, Frost Mage. But I guess, you know, you can also think of the fact that Devastation is a medium range caster with short range spells, so managing your distance and your positioning towards, or in relativity to, your groups and your targets might take some time to get used to. So maybe we'll put it somewhere in the middle there, maybe there. Maybe it's not as easy as some of the other specs, but I don't know if it's, or harder rather, but I don't know if it's as easy as people give it credit, considering that you're squishy, you have a lot of weaknesses that you have to juggle through, and if you don't really care about those weaknesses, then I guess it's whatever. Elemental Shaman. Now, when it comes to Elemental Shaman, it's one of the caches that I hold dear to my heart for a long time, and it used to be, before Shadowlands Arcane, it used to be maybe the hardest spec in the game to play, period. And in Dragonflight, in the last seasons, people have kind of underestimated the level of complexity that Elemental can reach with the tier set that just gives you meatballs all around, and you use meatballs regardless of the number of targets, regardless of the health of the targets, regardless if you're in a dungeon or a raid, you just meatball every day. People seem to like that. Nah, not really my thing, because I really liked when Elemental was very, very peculiar or delicate in terms of what buttons you press. You have a lot of buffs that you have to rotate and have to activate for different types of abilities, with Master of the Elements, Electrified Shocks, Ice Fury, and things like that, which have been made more streamlined across the years, where, for instance, Master of the Elements used to be something that you probably really only want to use on your consumers, on your spenders, but now it's probably fine if you just use it anywhere you want, and if you get a lot of Lava Burst procs, you probably have a lot of Master of the Elements buffs, and that's fine. Electrified Shocks has been a pain to play, to be honest. Even though I like difficult specs, I was not a fan of adding this to my plate to spin, especially if you're playing the Lightning, most likely Tempest build that will probably get you to play Lightning Rod. And that is, let's say, a different can of worms to play with. I don't know if a lot of people like this level of complexity or realize that it's actually there. And I can see why a lot of people might ask for a rework for Elemental, because looking at how Arcane has evolved in expressing its difficulty, we could probably use something like that for Elemental. But in my opinion, maybe just I'm a bad Elemental Shaman, it is the least easy spec to play right now in the range DPS category. It is actually very difficult to play if you want to play it properly, of course, because there's just so many things to juggle. And if you just play the meatball build, which I would be surprised if you keep on playing once the War Within launches, you're probably seeing this in a different tier. But as it stands right now, baseline, until it maybe gets some changes, that's where it's going to be. Shadow Priest has gone through a plethora of reworks, and I feel like most of these reworks have dumbed down its complexity over the years. Maybe that's for the best. I was a fan of some of the more quirky things that it could do with Surrender to Madness, with the old void form functionality of draining your insanity. Even in as early as Dragonflight, where you had Mind Tier as a separate consumer, once you had both Mind Tier and Psychic Link, you added a level of death to your AoE expression that made you choose a little bit like how you want to do your damage exactly. And I feel like we've kind of lost that and made it a little bit more straightforward. Maybe that's fine for a lot of people. And it feels like some of the capstones used to matter a little bit more in how you played with them. Back at the beginning of Dragonflight, the only one that might legit change your rotation would be the Yasharaj, the Mindbender capstone that just makes you want to spam your Mind Blast and your Shadow Word Deaths during your Mindbender to extend its duration as much as possible and keep it uptime. And I think you probably can even reduce its cooldown right now, and that's fine. In terms of its hero talents, Void Weaver is really fun, and being able to cast Void Turn while moving kind of made the rotation a little bit easier considering how static and immobile Shadow Priest is. While Archon is just different. It's fun, but it's different. I don't know if it changes too much. Probably just press Nova and that's about it. So I feel like overall Shadow has been made simpler across the years. Maybe it's not as simple as other specs. There is some inherent complexity with its utility similar to Mage, although it's not particularly difficult to execute, but you do have a lot of tools and a lot of things that you can interact with your Dispels, with your Purges, with your Power Infusions, with your Leap of Faiths and things like that are an acquired taste and might need a little bit of a work to get going. And in the end, this is my subjective opinion on how difficult or easy the specs are, which might not be the same for you, but it is a new age of World of Warcraft, and the cool things that are coming for the game are not actually over, because if you look at our latest video on our channel talking about the Gamescom potential announcement for World of Warcraft, it's clear that we are living in a whole brand new world of what we can expect as WoW players from the game, from the developers, from the company, and it's looking pretty sweet, man, I'm not gonna lie.